Chill out.
No, think Ansara, not Schwarzenegger this time.
Chill out.
That's better. That's better. Welcome to the ARKHAM Sessions, everybody. My name is Brian Ward, and as always, I'm joined by the incomparable Dr. Andrea Letamendi.
Hello.
Andrea, I couldn't possibly be any more excited than I am about this episode.
This is probably the most realistic episode psychologically. What I mean by that is the events that take place and the impact that they have on this particular villain is perhaps the most accurate in terms of his responses and his psychological presentation. So I'm just thoroughly excited that I finally get to talk about this.
This week we're diving into Heart of Ice. This is the episode that literally redefined the Mr. Freeze character for the entire DC universe. Not just the DC animated universe, but the whole universe. Comics, movies, video games. This episode started it all.
Tell listeners what you mean by that.
Okay, so here's the thing. Until this episode, which introduces him to Batman the Animated Series, Mr. Freeze was yet another silly, gimmicky character in Batman's Rogues Gallery. In fact, when he was first introduced in Batman number 121 in 1959, he was actually known as Mr. Zero.
Like Sub-Zero.
Yes, exactly like Sub-Zero. Of course, yeah, I mean, referring to 0 degrees, you know, the temperature at which fresh water freezes on the Celsius scale. He was created by David Wood and Shelley Meldoff, though I guess in the Batman land that all boils down to credit given to Bob Kane. But Dave Wood did, in fact, write the first Mr. Freeze story. It was called The Ice Crimes of Mr. Zero. And Shelley Meldoff was the penciler on that story. It actually wasn't until the 1960s TV series, starring Adam West and Burt Ward, that this character became known as Mr. Freeze. And all this time from the point that he was introduced in 1959 through the TV series, where he was played by 3 different folks, George Sanders first, then Otto Preminger, and then Eli Wallach. Mr. Freeze was pretty much one of those one-note gimmick villains who just froze things with his ice gun. So if he needed to rob a bank, he would just freeze whatever was in his way and then walk out with the money.
Right. I mean, interesting, but not quite. That wasn't a very deep sort of background or origin story for him.
No, nothing, no deep origin story, which is why during the development for the animated series, Paul Dini and Bruce Timm made the decision to give legitimate backstories to some of Batman's jokier characters. Because, let's face it, there were plenty of them, and frankly, they needed a rogues gallery, so Paul Dini wrote this beautiful story that would ultimately become Victor Freeze's legitimate origin story, not just in the animated series, but also in the comics going forward and in the Batman and Robin movie.
Chill out.
And, you know, that's been his story. Well, until Mr. Freeze was eventually reintroduced in the New 52, which even then still uses the basic framework for Dini's story, but they made a few changes to make it sort of twisty and turny.
Mm-hmm. Still some good stuff.
Absolutely. And what's funny is that actually if you look at the original writer's Bible for the animated series, this isn't Freeze's backstory at all. The writer's Bible actually reads, once a shifty cryogenics expert running a body freezing scam, Mr. Freeze eluded the police in his lab only to be found out by Batman. The two fought and Freeze was knocked into a cryogenics chamber where he was frozen into a near-death state. After he was revived, he discovered he could only live in sub-zero temperature and vowed to make Batman pay for what had happened to him. So
different.
Completely different, and I'm so glad they decided to go the route they did. All of that really is just a long-winded way of saying this episode is awesome.
It is. It's definitely, you know, up till now, many of the episodes have been well written. They've been interesting. They've been psychologically heavy. This one is remarkably psychologically accurate, as I mentioned, but also just very heartbreaking. And it asks us to question how we feel about people that do bad things. Like we actually explore the motivations of someone who's seeking vengeance and breaking rules and laws and quite, murderous. And so we're struggling a little bit in the audience with sort of moral distress, some feelings that were kind of brought out because of the writing, and I think that's really unique.
Absolutely. And this episode specifically even won the Emmy for Outstanding Writing in an Animated Series, and has since even become listed as the #1 episode for fans. So let's go ahead and dive in. The episode is called Heart of Ice. It was written by Paul Dini and directed by Bruce Timm. By the way, Andrea, something you especially might find interesting, given your love of Hellboy, Mike Mignola is credited for having designed this incarnation of Mr. Freeze.
Oh, you mean like his suit?
Yeah, like this version of Mr. Freeze is credited to Mike Mignola for...
I could see that.
For the design, yeah. Mm-hmm. The episode originally aired on September 7th, 1992. So if you're paying attention at home, this was actually the 3rd episode aired, which is interesting because when you see the newspaper clippings later in the Batcave, you'll notice they're from Pretty Poison and Nothing to Fear, which obviously hadn't happened yet in terms of air date order. But of course, we're doing this in production order, so we've seen those 2 cases. So these clippings make perfect sense to us. And by the way, if you've not heard those episodes focusing on Poison Ivy and Scarecrow, please download them now. Fears and Killer Vaginas, can't go wrong. Drea, let's briefly touch on the key points of the episode. Mr. Freeze is stealing parts to create a giant freeze cannon.
My word.
Because he's out for revenge against Gothcorp CEO Ferris Boyle. Boyle is the man Victor Freeze holds responsible for the death of his wife, Nora.
The monster who took you from me will soon learn that revenge is a dish best served cold.
Who was cryogenically frozen by Freeze after she was diagnosed with a terminal illness. And when Boyle found out about this little side project, he was livid and had the entire operation shut down.
I say this project ends now!
But in the process, he and Freeze have a little bit of a confrontation, which results in Boyle kicking Freeze into a set of chemicals that lowers his own body temperature to sub-zero temperatures. Now, in the beginning of the episode, as a result of the struggle, Boyle actually thinks Freeze is dead.
There's only one man who'd hate Gothcorp that much, if he were alive.
Right, he says like he hasn't seen him in a year.
Right.
And he actually says, we lost him.
Yeah, we lost him.
I mean, we certainly lost him in the sense of his
humanity.
humanity.
Yeah, we lost Victor Freeze, but now we have Mr.
Is
Freeze.
it possible that he knows? No, he seems pretty surprised.
Yeah, he seems pretty surprised.
Okay,
but, it actually turns out that Freeze now requires a special suit to survive and basically believes that, like his body, emotionally, he's completely cold. Drea, you have a completely different take on this, though.
Well, it's interesting because throughout the episode he says things like,
Yes, it would move me to tears if I still had tears to shed.
And everything about him, the voice, the facial expression or lack thereof, the detachment, him being in that suit itself and being detached or separated from humanity and from other people. It's as if he's asserting that he's lost his ability to have compassion, to have feelings, to care. But what's really interesting is that his actions kind of betray that, right? He's going after Ferris Boyle. He's, attacking anyone that gets in his way. And he says a lot of things about getting vengeance. And my understanding then is that there are actually a lot of emotions going on. And those emotions would be considered secondary emotions like anger, hatred, vengeance. In fact, his behaviors betray what he's saying because he's going after Ferris Boyle. He's seeking vengeance. It's almost like his life now is to go after this guy and to make him feel what his wife Nora perhaps felt, or to make him feel the way that Mr. Freeze himself feels. So I actually see a lot of emotions there. Possibly what would be considered secondary emotions, those emotions that may be the ones that he is experiencing, under that suit. But even below that, those emotions actually come from a primary emotion. And I would say that primary emotion is feeling hurt and feeling pain. Now, we don't see all that, and he may not admit that, but that's how I would kind of interpret his insistence on coming across as being cold and emotionless.
So I see exactly what you're saying, but not all the feelings that he brings out onto the surface are all that negative. He does bring out this desire of longing. He clearly misses her. He's talking to her through this snow globe.
I failed you. I wish there were another way for me to say it, but I cannot.
And he talks about wanting to feel the warmth of her hand.
To never again walk on a summer's day with a hot wind in your face and a warm hand to hold. Oh yes, I'd kill for that.
So he sort of has these pleasurable memories if he's not even felt these things in a long time.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's like those moments are quite sad because it's almost as if he's feeling longing for that.
Yes.
And you're right. He does remember. He has perhaps memories of what those feelings are to have his partner, those feelings of warmth and caring, but perhaps also this nostalgia. And yeah, I would say there are some positive feelings there.
So he says he's emotionless, that he doesn't have feeling, but clearly he's got a lot on the surface and even bubbling up from below the surface. What is the cause of all of that? What is his desire to keep these emotions down a result of?
Well, one thing that came to mind was all of those traumas that he experienced. And, you may be thinking like, well, it was just one trauma. He was just in this accident. But in fact, you can look at what happened in that lab as a series of multiple traumas. So breaking them down, one trauma is experiencing a life-altering, life-threatening accident. That's, he's physically impaired, physically changed by the accident that was caused by, the chemical explosion. The second is within that accident, his wife's life being threatened and the loss of someone very close to him.
Nora! Nora!
And finally, you have the betrayal or the injustice incurred on Mr. Freeze by someone that he trusted, his employer. So that experience of, being disillusioned, possibly trusting in someone and feeling betrayed, that could be an additional life-changing event that happened to him as well.
Right.
So if you think about it, like, it wasn't just one thing that happened to him, a number of physical, emotional, so like all of these, sort of a complex series of traumas completely changed his worldview. Prior to that, he could have potentially been a fairly healthy, adaptive scientist who was very compassionate, who was looking into treating, what he called inoperable ailments. I mean, he could have been particularly healthy, but the series of traumas that he experienced completely changed him.
And then there were the traumas prior to the accident in terms of he was actually feeling grief over his wife already.
That's a really good point. His wife was, she had some kind of illness. They don't specify, right? But she has some kind of illness. And in the file that Batman discovers when he's broken into Gothcorp, which is the company Ferris Boyle owns, he finds pictures of Nora and then her medical chart. And I think it says terminally ill and that her prognosis is fairly, bad. So you're right. He could have been particularly vulnerable prior to this series of traumas. But I do want to just emphasize that a number of things happened to him within this particular event that could have potentially shaped his worldview. And it's interesting because a couple of years ago, the Journal of Loss and Trauma investigated and looked into bereavement, which is, kind of normal grief after the loss of somebody. And they actually surveyed and studied a number of participants who lost loved ones due to cancer. Many of the participants were widows. And what they found is that up to 30% of those participants ended up getting PTSD following the death of their loved one.
Wow.
Yeah, and 26% had subclinical PTSD, which basically means that they met they met a lot of criteria for the disorder, but didn't quite hit all of them. So that means like a little, about half of them experienced or presented with post-traumatic stress symptoms following something that's, could be particularly normal part of life.
So if anywhere between 50 and 70% don't show signs of PTSD or don't suffer from PTSD,
Right.
What went wrong with Victor Fries in this case?
That's a great question because, how could we have predicted that experiencing those traumas would have led to him becoming Mr. Freeze?
Right.
How did Victor Freeze transform into Mr. Freeze? Well, what we know is that there are a number of questions that we should be asking following a traumatic event or a series of traumatic events that would actually predict the development of some kind of maladaptive response like PTSD. So questions that I would ask if I had access to Mr. Freeze following those accidents would be things like this. Was he able to say goodbye to Nora properly with full closure and reconciliation following the accident? Was he able to feel safe and secure himself following the accident? Did he understand what happened that led to the person's death? So in other words, what is his story of Nora's death? Is it full of blame? Is it full of accusation? Did he feel persecuted? Did he feel unfairness, injustice? Did he feel to blame?
And we know that he did because he's after the guy who he blames. But
Absolutely.
then he also blames himself a little bit, too.
Absolutely. So, this is typically important because sometimes someone's understanding of their loved one's death is actually skewed or inaccurate. So I've worked with a lot of veterans and soldiers, for instance, that feel particularly responsible for members of their cohort, their death or their illness, right? So I could have done something different. In the case of Mr. Freeze, yes, he has particularly, blameful thoughts about what happened, but he's actually accurate. He's right that Ferris Boyle is responsible for the death of his wife, right? Another question I would ask is, did he understand his own grief and his ability to express emotions? What does that mean? Is he understanding what's occurring with him emotionally? How does he reflect on his ability to adjust following the death of his wife? Did he have healthy attachments with someone or some people that actually care about him?
He doesn't really appear to. He sort of appears to be a loner after.
Yeah,
the
it's
accident.
unclear, but my understanding is that
Nora was all he had.
Yeah, I don't think he had friends or family or colleagues that he could confide in and get social support from. And that's another question I would ask. Did he feel socially supported? One of the strongest predictors of whether someone will develop PTSD after a loss is whether they have strong social support. That is a huge, huge factor in more, I would say, in normal adjustment and recovery after a traumatic stress, right? Another thing I would ask is, did he develop an ongoing positive connection with the person who died?
So, like the talking to his snow globe.
Yeah, I mean, one would say that it could be a positive connection in the sense that he's, remembering and reminiscing about good things. But he doesn't put the snow globe down, right? So
Right.
he has this almost fixation and rumination, and again, that feeling of betrayal and anger toward her death. And so that's not so much a positive connection. And finally, very importantly, did he fit the death into a useful view of the world? When I say useful, I mean, did he develop a set of beliefs about the world that will help him recover, develop new adaptive relationships, and build trust about relationships? No, right?
Right.
I would say the majority of these questions would be, the response would be no. Either those things didn't happen, those things were undermined, those that actually would increase the likelihood of being distressed and potentially developing PTSD.
Okay, but when you say PTSD, most people think of I don't know, returning veterans, people with flashbacks, nightmares, they jump when someone knocks over a trash can. Mr. Freeze seems, for lack of a better word, cool to anything like this. Unfazed. What would you say signs of PTSD would look like for someone like him?
Well, he's, I agree with you that kind of the classic representation of PTSD is different than what we see with him. But I think what we see that is a common symptom of PTSD is that sort of emotion management that's kind of gone wrong, right? So that numbness or lack of expressive abilities to show emotion, that's actually quite common with some people that have a post-traumatic stress response, in that not only do they kind of have lack of affect or their facial expressions seem emotionless, but also they have difficulty, accessing their emotions. They have difficulty talking about their emotions. When you ask how they feel, they will respond with, I feel nothing, or I don't know, I don't have the ability to feel. And that's what he says quite a bit, even in this episode when he describes his emotional state. The other thing that people experience with PTSD are negative cognitions or distorted cognitions. And this is actually outlined in the DSM. We've talked about the DSM before, right? That's
your big book.
Yeah, it's the big manual of psychological disorders, if you will. And every few years, they actually update the book. Luckily, thankfully, based on the research and literature that has new findings and new explanations of mental health disorders. And so the criteria or the list of symptoms that you are required to meet to get a diagnosis could change over the years. And with PTSD, something that actually has changed in this newer version, the DSM-5, includes more information about cognitive states or cognitive beliefs following a traumatic stressor. So for instance, just an example, a new item in the DSM-5 under PTSD is persistent distorted blame of self or others for causing the traumatic event or for resulting consequences. I mean, that sounds like him, right?
Yes.
This blaming.
Blames Boyle, blames himself a little bit. The I should have protected you kind of, yeah.
And what's always been in the criteria is the persistent and often distorted negative belief and expectations about the self and the world. So examples would be beliefs like, I am bad, the world is completely dangerous. For him, they would be things like, I cannot trust other people. The one person I loved was taken away from me.
Right.
I deserve love, but I cannot have it. So, when those beliefs are unreconciled and unchallenged, those thoughts continue to kind of like permeate in his mind, and it causes him distress because he believes in those things very strongly.
Right.
And he sees his world that way.
He does have an interesting take on it, though. He is certainly going after Ferris Boyle for revenge. He feels very cold when his henchman has his legs frozen. He sort of doesn't feel like he owes that person anything. In fact, it's his own fault for getting in the way.
He should have been more careful. Now he's paid the price for his incompetence.
But he allows Batman the opportunity to get out scot-free.
This is a personal vendetta. It doesn't concern you.
He's basically like, look, I won't hurt you, Batman. I've got no beef with you. I'm going after this other person. So he has no emotion toward other people, whereas he's got hatred for others. But then there are some that he's just sort of willing to bypass entirely.
Yeah,
I got nothing.
He has a mission. I mean, he even says, if you get in my way, I will consider you an enemy.
Right.
So, again, he seems to have developed this need to get revenge.
Right.
By, attacking and possibly, I mean, my understanding is he wants to freeze Ferris Boyle to the degree that he's, frozen, he's incapacitated, potentially brain dead, right? Mm-hmm. He wants Boyle to experience what his wife experienced. He
and
wants
even
him
wants
to die
to
the same
start.
way.
He wants to start from his feet and very slowly work his way up the body. You know, there was a point in time where he starts to freeze him. He gets about midway, but he's not doing it as quickly as he is other people. Like other people, their legs are instantly frozen. Mr. Freeze seems to be taking his time.
Well, he's torturing him. And,
Yeah.
and they also have an interesting dialogue there where, Boyle is begging for him to stop. And Mr. Freeze explains that, no, you have to experience what my wife did.
Right.
I think that's a very intense moment. And he's fulfilling this wish that he's had for a very long time. So it's really meaningful for him to see this man suffer. I mean, it's very sad too, because it's just sort of, he's playing out and reenacting what happened to his wife.
It kind of makes you wonder, though, if he did it, like if he succeeded, where would he go from there? Like, Mr. Freeze doesn't really seem to have any resentment or hatred toward anyone else. It almost makes you wonder if Batman had just let him take out Ferris Boyle, who Batman knows is a villain as well. He hears or he sees the videotape. He sees the accident happen. He knows Ferris Boyle is a bad person.
Right.
It's almost like if Batman were any other vigilante and allowed Victor to freeze him, I wonder what Victor would have, like how he would have been emotionally after that. Like, would he have been fulfilled?
Mm-hmm. It's possible that he would stop, being fixated on getting revenge.
Maybe his life of crime would be over, and
But
he
that
would just go on living
sure.
alone, doing
But
whatever.
that wouldn't take away his feelings of sadness and loneliness.
No.
I mean, think about soldiers too, who, if they feel that, the government, for instance, is responsible for their friend's death, and they went and, attacked. This sounds like an episode of Homeland. Like they go and attack a member of the government and murder them, let's say. They would still have feelings of, sadness and guilt and loss.
Right.
And we can talk about treatment later, but a lot of what needs to happen for Mr. Freeze is having a more healthy reconciliation and understanding of the loss of his wife. And, murdering Ferris Boyle isn't going to do it. So interestingly, some more symptoms from PTSD criteria that do look like Mr. Freeze are constricted affect, which means sort of this inability to experience or express positive emotions, which we kind of see with him. And a newly added item for PTSD is something called trauma-related alterations in arousal that worsen after the traumatic event. This would be things like self-destructive behavior or reckless behavior. And we kind of see, at the end of this episode, that Mr. Freeze he can be particularly violent and reckless, on his way to seeking revenge with Ferris.
So it sounds like you're leaning toward a PTSD approach to Mr. Freeze.
Yes, and mainly because prior to those series of traumatic events, he was, for the best of our ability to understand, a fairly adaptive, healthy scientist who, yes, was struggling with keeping his wife alive, but seemed to have his, his profession, his social life, things together. So that's the direction I would go in. Now, interestingly, again, in this new iteration of the DSM, there is a new category that was created out of some literature showing that some people do experience a number of things following the death of a loved one, and it's almost like this idea of dysfunctional grief. So you've heard those stages of grief following loss that people experience, and those are actually considered normal, expected stages following hearing bad news, usually that lead to loss or death, right? But there's also this idea of dysfunctional grief, or the lack of the ability to kind of recover after a loss or after the death of a loved one. And typically that would be after many months, if not years, researchers who have brought up this new category, which is actually called persistent complex bereavement disorder, believe that the person is kind of derailed, or they even say frozen in their grief. Isn't that interesting?
Oh, yeah.
What's also interesting is that the psychologist has to ascertain that at least 12 months have passed since the death of a loved one that this person is grieving over. And what do we know about Mr. Freeze's accident and the loss of his wife? It happened exactly a year ago. So that alignment is interesting to me.
So basically, researchers watched Heart of Ice and then wrote a new grief stage
just based on that.
Just based on this episode. So we mentioned it earlier. Let's talk about this snow globe that Freeze carries around a little bit. He carries it around constantly. He's talking to it as if it's Nora. It's a ballerina that twirls around inside this dome with snow. And Victor says,
This is how I'll always remember you. Surrounded by winter, forever young, forever beautiful.
Now, might be a little morbid, and I don't know if you necessarily agree, but to me, this sort of suggests to me that he prefers to remember her as cryogenically frozen in this tube. I mean, the dome that she's in looks very similar to the tube. It's snowing inside, so clearly it's cold. Mm-hmm. What about you?
I think it's, I do want to say that having some kind of object or token to remember someone by, that's certainly normal, and that actually could help the grieving process. What he's doing is interesting because, as you said, he's kind of remembering her in a weird state. He's not really remembering her in a way that he's valuing, her personality, her attributes, her characteristics, how he felt when he was with her. There's this weird kind of detached way that he's just fixated on this little kind of mini fig, this little figure of her, and it's just unrealistic.
He's also seems to be fixated on the idea of saving her. Like, he doesn't like to remember her as being healthy. He likes to remember her as someone in this glass tube that has hope that he will come up with a cure for whatever the ailment is, or that at least the cryogenics that he is so in love with keep her maintained until a cure is found. Because he never actually talks about wanting to find the cure himself. He just talks about, I want to have her frozen until someone does come up with a cure. So I don't know. It's almost like he's more in love with the idea of his science than his wife.
Right. And I would even say that his vision or his illusion of connectedness and love might not be particularly healthy.
Right.
I think what happened to him tragically now fragmented his perception of a bond. And now that, that definition or that feeling of what a bond with another person is sort of, like you said, this like kind of simplistic, really objectifying, kind of strange relationship. And and again, he's just constantly fixated on it, and it continues to fuel his anger and his hatred. So it does serve a function. Carrying that around serves a function to fuel those negative emotions in him.
So it's not necessarily emotionally healthy to have something like this that's a constant reminder.
Well, in his case, it's not being used for something that I would consider adaptive.
Right. At the end of the episode, both villains get their comeuppance. Batman provides evidence of Boyle's crime to the media. Freeze is taken to Arkham Asylum after the glass dome that covers his head is shattered by Batman's hot chicken soup.
Well, right. So Batman has a cold throughout the episode.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Alfred makes him soup and puts it in a little canister.
A thermos. Yeah. And
he takes it out of his. I don't know where he's carrying that because it's a sizable
It
thermos.
is sizable, but Batman is able to hide it, just as Alfred was able to pull it out of his inside jacket pocket in the Batcave. So apparently
Collapsible.
it's a collapsible thermos.
But it cures. So it's funny because he breaks it over Mr. Freeze's.
He doesn't even
helmet.
break it though. He opens it and pours it,
yeah.
and the hot liquid, I guess mixed with the cold, makes the glass brittle or something. It shatters. I don't know. It does something that Batman's fist couldn't even do. Mr. Freeze ends up getting taken to Arkham Asylum. Mm-hmm. Now, for starters, Drea, is Arkham where you would send a guy like Victor Freeze? Is he, quote unquote, criminally insane?
I don't like that word or that term, but it's used for Arkham Asylum because the people that need to be in Arkham Asylum, if they weren't there, would engage in crime, right?
Right.
So they have to be there. But the way that I would approach it is that, again, he has this inability to recover after this trauma, after this loss and death of someone very close to him. So putting him, in a prison is not going to help him. He will continue to ruminate about it and feel those negative emotions and not reconcile and find new meaning around what happened. One could argue that he's charged for the crimes, but he could still have a mental disorder. And yes, in prison, you could be receiving psychiatric treatment. Depending on where you are, it may not be great.
Right.
But realistically, yes, that's what would happen to him. He would be institutionalized. He would be in a prison, and he would be getting psychiatric help in that prison. That's what would be offered to him if he's exhibiting those symptoms of, numbness, depression, continuing to ruminate about wanting revenge and so forth. They would probably provide him with treatment there.
And of course, as we all know, if you read the comics, we know that he's in Arkham Asylum, not necessarily because he's quote unquote insane, but because it's the only facility that has the ability to provide him with the sub-0 degree cell that he needs in order to survive. I don't know why they've got a refrigerated cell or why it's got a window.
I know that's a weird thing at the end of the episode where we actually see him. It's not weird in the sense that, of course, he's holding the snow globe with Nora.
Yeah, they let him have the snow globe.
Of course they did.
He could shatter that thing and he could cut himself, or he could... He's
not going to, though, because they know that that's, the last remnant of his wife. But what's interesting is that he's outside of his suit, he's able to breathe and he has this sense of freedom, but it doesn't seem to be enough. The suit doesn't make him Mr. Freeze, right? He's still very saddened, feeling very alone and feeling the sense of loss. And you're right, there's a big old window there. So I don't know how they can afford to keep that little space in a sub-zero environment because there's that open window and all of that energy is leaving the room.
Yeah.
And then there's Batman on a ledge watching him creepily.
Always.
Yeah.
Always creepily watching. So how would you go about treating Freeze now that he is in custody? He's in this cell. He's got nothing better to do than to undergo treatment.
Well, it's interesting because as we talked about, what's keeping him in this state of emotional numbness and distress. So it's sort of this interesting juxtaposition, right? He has the inability to express positive emotion, but he also has these deep-seated negative feelings of anger and resentment. We have to offer him the opportunity to resolve and reconcile this loss. We can't change what happened, right? 3 terrible things happened. So we would have this acceptance. These three traumatic events happened. Let's define them and understand them. We have to understand the loss of control or the inability to change the past. And finally, we would want to help him create a new meaning around the loss and death of his wife and the things that happened to him. So it would be very difficult, of course. It would be very challenging to do, but we would explore with him how he might have built resilience from this. What story can come from this that is a story of strength, a story of empowerment, a story of great love. And how can he move on and transition from that story? So it's both understanding the story, but sort of leaving it, processing it and leaving it in the past, and the ability to move on and develop new relationships while still respecting and valuing the relationship that he had. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, as always, I like to look at real life and apply a little of it to what we've seen in Batman the Animated Series. This week, I present to you freeze rays.
Chill out.
Drea, it turns out freeze rays are actually possible. What Victor Freeze is using, possible.
So this story is completely accurate.
Yeah, it's good. It's really kind of scary to think about. In an article I read from Popular Science from 2009, I learned that German scientists have been able to turn pressurized gas into ice by using lasers. They were basically able to knock electrons out of their orbits, which obviously cools everything down, and the result is their ability to freeze this pressurized gas before it could even become liquid. So from gas to solid ice almost instantaneously. They talk about using this for boring stuff like better refrigeration. But frankly, all I can envision is freezing death ray technology.
Wow.
So that's it for this episode. How do you feel?
Frozen.
Next week's a slightly lighter episode with The Cat and the Claw Part 1.
Ooh,
yeah, you
know what that means.
You can only imagine. And another two-parter. So
cool.
Sweet. Drea, what have you got to plug?
Well, this week, if folks are interested in learning more about my feelings on Mr. Freeze, in addition to some other DC villains, there's actually a documentary called Necessary Evil, Supervillains of DC Comics. And that was released by Warner Brothers and DC Comics last fall.
Yeah.
And so a number of different artists, writers, producers, bunch of
creme de la creme.
Very, very creative folks, including Paul Dini, and actually myself, make appearances in that documentary. So you can actually get it on Amazon. You can also get it on...
And pretty much anywhere else that home media can be found.
Yes, this is true.
Best Buys and Targets and all of that.
Yeah, some cool stuff there.
Cool. So, Drea, how can folks contact you?
They can contact me on Twitter at ArkhamAsylumDoc or on my website, underthemaskonline.com.
You can contact me on Twitter. I am at bward028. You can also email the show if you have any questions, comments, praise, complaints, praise, more praise. We are Arkham Sessions at gmail.com. You can also like us on Facebook. Just look up the Arkham Sessions there.
And we can haunt you in your dreams.
That's right. That's a different episode, but we can absolutely do that. Till next week, guys, I'm Brian Ward.
I'm Dr. Andrea Letamendi.
And we are
the Arkham Sessions.
But the whole universe, comics, movies, video games, this episode started it all.
Tell listeners what you mean by that.
Okay, so here's the thing. Until this episode, which introduces him to Batman the Animated Series, Mr. Freeze was yet another silly, gimmicky character in Batman's Rogues Gallery. In fact, when he was first introduced in Batman number 121 in 1959, he was actually known as Mr. Zero.
Like Sub-Zero.
Yes, exactly like Sub-Zero. Of course, yeah, I mean, referring to 0 degrees, the temperature at which fresh water freezes on the Celsius scale. He was created by David Wood and Shelley Meldoff, though I guess in the Batman land, that all boils down to credit given to Bob Kane. But Dave Wood did, in fact, write the first Mr. Freeze story. It was called The Ice Crimes of Mr. Zero. And Shelley Meldoff was the penciler on that story. It actually wasn't until the 1960s TV series, starring Adam West and Burt Ward, that this character became known as Mr. Freeze. And all this time from the point that he was introduced in 1959 through the TV series, where he was played by three different folks, George Sanders first, then Otto Preminger, and then Eli Wallach. Mr. Freeze was pretty much, and this episode specifically even won the Emmy for Outstanding Writing in an Animated Series, and has since even become listed as the #1 episode for fans. So let's go ahead and dive in. The episode is called Heart of Ice. It was written by Paul Dini and directed by Bruce Timm. By the way, Andrea, something you especially might find interesting, given your love of Hellboy, Mike Mignola is credited for having designed this incarnation of Mr. Freeze.
Oh, you mean like his suit?
Yeah, like this version of Mr. Freeze is credited to Mike Mignola for...
I could see that.
For the design, yeah. Mm-hmm. The episode originally aired on September 7th, 1992. So if you're paying attention at home, this was actually the third episode aired, which is interesting because when you see the newspaper clippings later in the Batcave, you'll notice they're from Pretty Poison and Nothing to Fear, which obviously hadn't happened yet in terms of air date order. But of course, we're doing this in production order, so we've seen those two cases. So these clippings make perfect sense to us. And by the way, if you've not heard those episodes focusing on Poison Ivy and Scarecrow, please download them now. Fears and Killer Vaginas, can't go wrong. Drea, let's briefly touch on the key points of the episode. Mr. Freeze is the writer's Bible actually reads, once a shifty cryogenics expert running a body freezing scam, Mr. Freeze eluded the police in his lab only to be found out by Batman. The two fought and Freeze was knocked into a cryogenics chamber where he was frozen into a near-death state. After he was revived, he discovered he could only live in sub-zero temperature and vowed to make Batman pay for what had happened to him. So
different.
Completely different, and I'm so glad they decided to go the route they did. All of that really is just a long-winded way of saying this episode is awesome.
It is. It's definitely, up till now, many of the episodes have been well written. They've been interesting. They've been psychologically heavy. This one is remarkably psychologically accurate, as I mentioned, but also just very heartbreaking. And it asks us to question how we feel about people that do bad things. Like we actually explore the motivations of someone who's seeking vengeance and breaking rules and laws and quite, murderous. And so we're struggling a little bit in the audience with moral distress, some feelings that were, kind of brought out because of the writing. And I think that's really unique.
Absolutely. One of those one-note gimmick villains who just froze things with his ice gun. So if he needed to rob a bank, he would just freeze whatever was in his way and then walk out with the money.
Right. Interesting, but not quite. That wasn't a very deep sort of background or origin story for him. No deep origin story, which is why during the development for the animated series, Paul Dini and Bruce Timm made the decision to give legitimate backstories to some of Batman's jokier characters. Because, let's face it, there were plenty of them, and frankly, they needed a rogues gallery, so Paul Dini wrote this beautiful story that would ultimately become Victor Freeze's legitimate origin story, not just in the animated series, but also in the comics going forward and in the Batman and Robin movie. Chill out.
And, that's been his story. Well, until Mr. Freeze was eventually reintroduced in the New 52, which... even then still uses the basic framework for Dini's story, but
Right.
they made a few changes to make it sort of twisty and turny.
Still some good stuff.
Absolutely. And what's funny is that actually, if you look at the original writer's Bible for the animated series, this isn't Frieza's backstory at all.
Chill out.
No, think Ansara, not Schwarzenegger this time.
Chill out.
That's better. That's better. Welcome to the ARKHAM Sessions, everybody. My name is Brian Ward, and as always, I'm joined by the incomparable Dr. Andrea Letamendi.
Hello.
Andrea, I couldn't possibly be any more excited than I am about this episode.
This is probably the most realistic episode psychologically. What I mean by that is the events that take place and the impact that they have on this particular villain is perhaps the most accurate in terms of his responses and his psychological presentation. So I'm just thoroughly excited that I finally get to talk about this.
This week we're diving into Heart of Ice. This is the episode that literally redefined the Mr. Freeze character for the entire DC universe, not just the DC animated universe,